O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the storm.
Welcome to the King's Hand in History podcast. I'm Chris Van Dusen, and I'm here to proclaim the King's glorious deeds. In this episode, I am going to talk to you about the French and Indian War, the military prelude to the American War for Independence, the American Revolution. As this marks the 2.5 century anniversary of one of the most significant events in all history, that is the American Revolution, that began in 1775, I want to give you a new background lesson to explain that conflict by recounting the most significant event that immediately contributed to its circumstances. This is the poorly known French and Indian War again, which was fought from 1754 to 1760 in North America, but it was part of the larger global 7 Years' War, which didn't end until 1763 with the Treaty of Paris between France and Great Britain. So, why do I want to tell you the story of the King's Hand and the conflict that established the United States, the American Revolution? Because in spite of many arguments to the contrary, I believe the King did something special in setting up this nation as one of the few nations in history that have most honored, defended, and propagated his gospel through the liberty and industriousness of his body, Christ's body, living within it. And because Americans, Westerners, and all who feel any influence from the U.S. should understand some of the history of how the King used its forming to uphold truth and righteousness through some of the most courageous, wise, and industrious people that have ever lived on earth. And most of the basis for their uniqueness was the influence they had from the predominantly Christian and biblical education and training they were brought up with in the British colonies in North America. So let's look at how the King first set the stage for the revolution and the actions of its great men and women as we follow his hand in the people of the young American states. So again, I want to bring to you the story of the American Revolution, and to begin, I want to start looking at the background of it in the French and Indian War. Now, I want to tell you a few things about war itself, because we're going to be talking about war. We have talked about it in the past in this podcast, but I want to make clear to you that I don't delight in it. I used to be a war buff. And there are a lot of things that can excite you about war, but we must understand the severity of war, that it is a grave thing, that it is a necessary evil. So this podcast seeks to show you that the ruler of the universe, Jesus Christ, has had his hand in all the events of history in order to further the influence of his spiritual kingdom to the building up of his people, Christians, and the salvation of sinners. So war is included in this grand story of his. War is a part of history. Yet we must recognize that despite people's favorable attitudes toward it, it's, like I said, a necessary evil by its very nature. The success of war depends on killing human beings that bear God's image. That it brings about the death that God has cursed humanity with because of our sin. It tears apart families, gives free rein to the worst passions of hateful people, and destroys both human and natural creations. That is, it destroys societies, it destroys infrastructure, and it also tears up the natural world. As we'll show, this war, the French and Indian War, was by hardly any means a just war. There were some elements of it that complicated, so that some people were fighting because they thought they were defending their homes or their livelihood. But for the most part, this war was motivated by greed, personal and national pride, and hatred toward others. But there is, I want to give a note that there is a place for just war, I believe, as we see in Old Testament times with the wars that the Lord waged upon the nations of Canaan, for example. So in this war, the French and Indian War, there were some people, such as the colonists, who they felt threatened by the French, encroaching upon their homes, and also the Indians and the French, they would be very threatening towards many of those colonists as well, and some of them were simply defending their lives. But for the most part, the major players in the war, the British and the French, they were fighting it so that they could expand their territory, could gain more resources, and could be more powerful in the world. So here's the background. On July 3rd, and that's more than 250 years ago, about 270 years ago, July 3rd, 1754, a 22-year-old George Washington surrendered his small group of soldiers to French forces after a humiliating and unsurprising defeat. This was called the Battle of Fort Necessity, the fort that he was fighting at. It was a makeshift fort. It wasn't much of a fort at all. It was mainly a stockade. But this was the first major battle of the French and Indian War. And this war was the military prelude to the American Revolution. And then 21 years later, after this fight, the surrender of George Washington, on July 3rd of 1775, he would take command of the Continental Army at Cambridge, Massachusetts. So that's our snapshot into this war. 270 years ago, George Washington, one of the main founders of the United States, the main leader of the American Revolution, he surrendered his small force in a humiliating defeat in the beginning of the French and Indian War. So let me give you a background to this war, an introduction to it, and a summary of it, why it's important. Now, I'm not that excited about talking about it because it doesn't have many elements that really inspire me, or could inspire sincere Christians or seeking to live out the faith. The Christian influence in the war is very little. There were some missionaries involved, and obviously many of the men that fought in the war were Christians. However, for the most part, this is a very sad and discouraging war, and yet it set up the circumstances that led to the beginning of the American Revolution, which I believe is one of the most important events in all of history, because the United States is one of the most important nations in all of history. And I'm not going to be ashamed of that. I'm not going to be afraid of saying that. It's simply the truth that this nation has upheld Christianity and propagated it, perhaps more than any other in history. And so the founding of it set up that ability for us to have Christianity be a shining light on a nationwide scale, because most of the founders, most of the colonists, were professors of the Christian faith, at least for the most part, for a large part, up until the American Revolution. And in fact, right after the French and Indian War, I'm sorry, not right after, right before, was the First Great Awakening, in which so many people were saved. So you have a Christian revival where there was a great outpouring of the Holy Spirit and a great number of people converted right before this war. And yet it seems to have had I guess ostensibly at least, a little impact upon the conduct of the war. I do not, in my studies of it, I did not see many examples of people preaching the gospel in the armies or to the natives or on the frontier. And yet it's still important because the Lord used it in order to set the stage for the revolution. So this war was between the British Army and colonials on the one side, and the French and most of the Indians that fought in the war on the other side. The British did have the Iroquois Indians on their side, at least some of the time. A lot of the time, though, they were simply neutral. They didn't participate. But this war, again, set some of the major conditions that led to the motivators for the colonists, the American colonists, the British colonists in North America, in seeking political and economic independence from Great Britain. It solidified Britain's hold on North America with the takeover of Canada, led them to levy numerous new taxes on the colonists, as we're going to discuss at the end here, preceding the Revolution. It contributed to the Indians' various attitudes and stances toward the European people in the Revolution. So the Indians were greatly affected by the war. The war, again, was a war of expansion, and the Indians lost land, and they lost homes, they lost livelihoods, they lost opportunities for trade. So they were much involved, and they suffered greatly from the war. Although they also did great feats of evil upon people during the war, as we're going to see. But most importantly, this war served perhaps most importantly, it served as a testing ground for many leaders and soldiers that would fight in the Revolution on both the British and American sides. So key people that participated in the events surrounding the war, not just the fighting, the military side of the war, but simply the things that happened during the course of the war. They included, like I've already noted, George Washington, Daniel Morgan, who was the famous leader of Morgan's Rangers in the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Gage, who was a British officer, and later he was one of the main commanders during the main British commanders during the American Revolution. Now, this war shows us the great lengths that men are willing to go to obtain wealth and land, protect national honor, and simply obey their superiors even to the death. So many, if you think about many of the soldiers there, they were simply doing their duty, and they didn't have any other choice unless they wanted to lose their lives or their livelihood. They simply had to obey, and they had to risk their lives for their station in life as soldiers. And ultimately, the great loss of life that resulted from it, there were about 8,000 total casualties during the 7 Years' War. Like I said, the 7 Years' War is the big war conflict, global conflict between France and Great Britain, while the French and Indian War refers specifically to the North American conflict that happened only in North America, mainly the current day northeastern United States and Canada. So what were the circumstances of the war? Well, like I've already noted, expansion. So you have Great Britain and France. They are in the New World. They have already established colonies there. They have France has what's called New France, which is southeastern modern-day Canada, including most notably the cities of Montreal and Quebec. And the English, obviously, they have the 13 colonies stretching along the eastern seaboard of the present-day United States. And they have vast territories in the west, toward the west of this. Now, this is present day. When we're talking about the frontiers of the day, we're talking about modern-day Ohio and the Great Lakes region. That's frontier now. And what we're going to see here is one of the great points of contention was who would control what's called the Ohio territory, the Ohio River Valley frontier. And both the British and the French, they want to expand in there. They want to have control of the Great Lakes and of this Ohio region. It's called Ohio because of the Ohio River. But it stretches not just in modern day Ohio, but also it is really in western Pennsylvania, current day western Pennsylvania, and it even goes as far south as modern day West Virginia. And this is important, first of all, for trade with the Indians. The French now, the French in the New World, they were mainly focused upon trading with the Indians. They had many trading posts around the Great Lakes region. But they didn't really have many big settlements like the British did. The British were not that much involved in trading. They were involved in trading, but that was not their emphasis, at least when they started to colonize. They were seeking to establish permanent settlements and expand the territory. And both the French and the British, they want to have control of the Ohio River region. The French, not just for trade, but also because the Ohio River leads to the Mississippi River, and they have control of modern-day Louisiana, the Louisiana Territory, named after one of the King Louis. And he was one of the Louis. I forgot which one. Might have been 15, but regardless, he was the king of France at this time. The French want this Ohio River region so that they can have a connection point to their territory in the West, specifically in Louisiana, as well as for trading centers they have with the Indians. The British, they want it for trade as well, and also for settlement, and especially colonists who lived in Pennsylvania and Virginia. They want to move west into the Ohio region. Now, it is a disputed territory, and there are many, obviously, at this time, Indian settlements there. There are Indian territories there. And yet, both France and Great Britain, they want to expand in there. So they were basically vying for the territory. And this is what sparks the French and Indian War. When the British actually advanced there, the French have already established trading posts and forts in the Ohio River region, but the British don't want them there, and they send a small force led by George Washington. I forgot what rank he was at this time. He might have been a colonel. Regardless, he led a small force of Virginia militia sent by Virginia Governor Dinwiddie, his name, to warn the French to leave the region. And this advance is what sparks the beginning of this war. Like I said, the French have many garrisons and forts on the frontier, this frontier region, as well as in the Great Lakes region, which is part of the way they can send ships and supplies down to Louisiana and to this Ohio frontier. Now, some of these forts' names are Fort Beausejour, Fort Louisbourg, Fort Frontenac, which will come into play later as we discuss an important part in this war, and Fort Duquesne. It's a French term. So they guarded their sea and river routes from the Canadian cities to the Ohio Valley. Like I said, also, another thing that led to this war was colonial land grabs, British colonial land grabs. The British colonists were seeking to take land in the Ohio Valley that was unoccupied. Now, it might have had some Indian presence, but much of it was simply not settled. It did not have permanent communities or settlements there. And so a lot of the colonists, they wanted to have land. So back then, what your wealth was, usually for most people, your wealth consisted of land. Because on land is where you could grow crops, you could raise livestock, and that was your wealth to provide for your family and to start a new life. So at this time, we're talking now in the 1750s. Like I said, the war began in 1754. So around that time, the Virginia government actually commissioned surveyors to survey the land in Ohio and to make it ready to divide up the land, parse up the land, and to map it out so that settlers could move there and start new lives. At At the same time, the French are there as well, and they want to expand into the territory. They want to make new trading posts, and they don't want any of the British there. Now, on that note, I want to explain that the French and the British have been enemies, sworn enemies, since the 1200s. So that's 400, 500 years of fighting. You look at the history of France and Britain, and it is a series of several wars they're fighting. And so they are enemies. And they don't want to cooperate with each other. They want to, in fact, now that the power struggle is on a global scale, now that they are empires and they are expanding onto new continents with colonies, they are vying for power, for wealth. They want to have the upper hand in the power struggle in Europe, because it is a constant competition between them to see who will be more powerful. And so they are now bringing that struggle into the New World, into this Ohio region, and the British go there to tell the French, you need to get out of here. Whilst the French are claiming the territory for themselves. They actually sent a person out there to literally put things in the ground to signify that they owned the land. So you have this competition here in this mostly unclaimed, unsettled region of the Ohio River Valley. Also, another thing that came into play with the circumstances of this is the Indian alliances. Now, there is a confederacy of Indians called the Iroquois Confederacy that mainly live in modern-day upstate New York, stretching throughout a huge territory. It consisted actually of 6 different tribes. They're called the Six Nations also, but they are a united confederacy. They are a very complex and very unified and developed united nation, basically, that work together in trade and in war, so they can prosper and they can defend each other. The Iroquois Confederacy, during the beginning of this war, they have actually, beforehand, they had made an alliance with the British. It was a covenant of some kind, but they had broken that off because they thought that the British were basically robbing them, were not treating them them fairly, and that's going to come into play in 1754 when the the colonists attempt to reestablish this treaty with the Iroquois Confederacy, so they will be on their side in the struggle with France. So at the very least, they will be neutral and not be fighting against them, because this is a powerful group of Indian tribes. But most of the tribes that are involved in this war were aligned with the French, because the French were more congenial. The French really left them alone a lot of times and simply traded with them rather than going into their territory and setting up towns and asserting their authority upon them. The French had more of a friendly, more of a neutral and soft stance toward the Indians, whereas the British were more domineering and they tried to take advantage of the Indians. So many of the Indians around the Great Lakes were allied with the French. I forgot exactly which tribes they were. I'm sorry, that's not right. Huron, at the very least. There were several others that were aligned with them. But anyway, they are partners with the French in trade and in war. And then you have the age-old rivalry, like I said here in my notes, between the British and the French. So, to start the war off, Like I said, on July 3rd of 1754, George Washington was in the Ohio River Valley region. And he had gone there on May 28th on the orders of Governor Dinwiddie to tell the French to get out of the region. And there was a small band of French diplomats, really, led by this man named Ensign de Jumonville. And when George Washington and his forces encountered them, they actually opened fire upon them and killed a third of the men with him and wounded this man, Ensign de Jumonville. Washington had a group of Indians with him led by this man, which his Indian name is often ignored because it's so hard to pronounce. So historians call him the Half King. He was not really he wasn't a chief, but he was a leader of the Iroquois. And he ends up actually murdering this man, de Jumonville, as an act of vengeance upon him. It's said that before, when he was shot, he was lying on the ground bleeding, and the Half-King tells him, "Thou art not yet dead, my father." And he smashed open his... I'm sorry, this is going to be graphic. He basically he cracked his skull, and according to tradition, he actually ate some of the insides of his skull. Now, Washington is actually later blamed for this because the French later on, after Washington's surrender at the Battle of Fort Necessity, the French forced him to make a confession that he was the one that fired upon the diplomatic party led by Jumonville. And it's actually written in French, and he has a Dutch translator who doesn't really understand French well. And Washington thinks he is simply agreeing that he ordered the attack upon this French force, when in reality what the document states is that I, Washington, was engaged in an assassination, a deliberate, unwarranted, premeditated assassination upon Ensign de Jumonville. So Washington is blamed for this. It's interesting. He did not, thankfully for him, he did not actually get a bad report from his superiors in the British Army. Yet we have this unwanted confession on the part of Washington. Now remember, again, like I said, Washington at this time he was 22 years old. And so this was the beginning of his military career as a leader of the Virginia militia forces. And he begins the war with Fort Necessity with his small force who was going into Ohio. The French come and they attack his fort. It's a very poor defensive position, and they are defeated. They surrender, and thankfully for him, the French give him very good terms that they can just leave with all of their supplies and go back to what they were doing, which is interesting. That due to the European rules for war, they treat one another well for the most part when they are determining terms of surrender for people. So that is the beginning of the war. Because Washington's force has entered Ohio River Valley, now the French are ticked off, and they are sending forces into the Ohio region. And the British realize that they need to make greater efforts to defeat the French. Ultimately, the goal of the British government is to force the French to leave New France so that they can have the control of North America, not just the Ohio River Valley, but the whole of the northeastern North America. Now, I should note, like I remarked on earlier, that before this, in May through July of 1754, the colonies in North America, they had gathered for what's called the Albany Congress. And what they were doing there was trying to reestablish the treaties that they had previously made with the Iroquois Confederacy, that the Iroquois would remain neutral towards them and not harm them. And that's what they do during this Albany Congress in the city of Albany, New York. They reestablished this covenant with the Iroquois Confederacy that the Iroquois are now neutral towards the British. And also during this time, this is the first major effort by the colonies to come to an agreement on how to unite together in order to form a colonial government on North American soil, kind of like a North American version of the British Parliament, but simply with representatives from the colonies. There are 7 colonies that are represented in this Congress, this meeting, and one of the delegates from the colony of Pennsylvania is none other than Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, at this time, his trade was as a printer, and that's how he got rich, was through running a printing shop. But now, after he got rich from that, he retired and he entered into politics, and now he is a politician. And he actually comes there with a note card containing something called hints on the Union of the Colonies, or something to that effect. And he wants to present to the colonies a plan of union. This is called the Albany Plan of Union. They discuss it after their deliberation with the Iroquois, and they come away with a plan to try to convince the legislatures of the colonies to unite together to raise funds in order to support their common defense, and to work together against the threats of the French and the Indians. However, nothing really lasting or significant comes of it. None of the colonies, when the delegates go back to the colonies, agree to working to this, and the British Parliament certainly does not agree with the plan to give them the permission to form their own kind of separate parliament. But this is a precursor, and it is a predecessor, I forgot what the other word is, to the later Continental Congress. This is the first time where they actually do this. Now, the war is underway now, and so we'll get into the major battles of the war. But first, I want to take a break, and then we will begin with the capture of Fort Beauséjour by the British and the invasion of Nova Scotia and the deportation of the Acadians. But let's take a short break, and we'll begin really in earnest with the major events of the war. Hey, do you enjoy studying the Bible, reading it, and learning what it means to follow Jesus and obey him faithfully? Well, I have a blog called bearingchrist.blog. Its motto is to know Christ and him crucified. There I have hundreds of Bible study articles, devotionals, book reviews, as well as analysis on current events and how we are to live as Christ bearers in this present evil age. Also there you can check out my new recent book that was just published this year called The New Testament Revival of Western Christianity, How to Restore the Love, Leadership, and Learning that the Apostles taught. I think it would be a blessing to you. You can get a PDF version for a very limited price there, and you can also find it on Amazon in print and Kindle editions. Again, it's bearingchrist.blog, to know Christ and him crucified. Continuing on, we start with the next major battle of the war, which is the capture of the French fort Beauséjour by British Colonel Robert Monckton in June the next year, 1755. When he captures this fort, what happens is the British actually deport the French colonists who live there in Nova Scotia, called the Acadians. And many of them move to the Louisiana Territory, where we get the modern-day Cajuns. That's where Cajun comes from, Acadian. So these people become what we know as the Cajuns today. Louisiana, remember, Louisiana was originally a French territory, and so many French people lived there, including these Acadians that were deported by the British, because the British want Nova Scotia under the control of Englishmen and not Roman Catholics. Now remember, there is also a religious influence in play here, because the French are Roman Catholic for the most part, whereas the British are mostly Protestant. For the most part, they are members of the Church of England. And remember, the Church of England is a state church, and France is basically you're by default basically Roman Catholic if you are a French person. The next major event of the war is the Battle of Monongahela in the Ohio River region in 1755. William Braddock, General William Braddock, leads his forces in the Ohio River region to try to actually the objective is to take the major Fort Duquesne in order to gain control of the forks of the Ohio River. He leads a force of over 1,000 men, among whom are George Washington, who is one of his aides in leading one of the Virginia militia regiments, as well as Thomas Gage, who will later play a major role in the Revolution, and also Horatio Gates, who will be on the American side in the Revolution. So the French move out of Fort Duquesne to confront the British, and Braddock believes that the British ought to continue to wage war based on the European style of fighting. Now remember, in that time period, the way that you fight wars is mostly with infantry, footmen, who form long lines of battle, shoulder to shoulder, and fire together in volleys. And basically, it's like a boxing match, kind of, what that kind of war is. Now, we have to imagine as well, in this type of war, the smoke from the gunpowder is tremendous. The battlefields of those wars, you could not see a thing, and the only person you could usually see when the firing is going on in earnest is the person to your right and the person to your left, and that's why they have the battle flags, to show you where you're supposed to be, where your unit is. Now, the British fight this battle in the standard European way, whereas the French and the Indians who attack them are fighting guerrilla style behind trees, and they surround the British, and the British are basically they're defeated beyond any shadow of a doubt. There are over 400 British dead, including the British commander Braddock. So it's a major blunder for the British in this beginning of the war. And so the British realize they need to step up their game. They need to adopt better strategies, and they also need to figure out a way so that they can use their Indians as allies. So in the next year, 1756, the British officially declare war on the French, and this starts what's called the 7 Years' War. So they are mobilizing for war here. The British want to remove the French from the Ohio region. They want to attack the French major cities in New France, modern-day Canada, including Quebec and Montreal. They want to push the French out of there. They want to defeat the French naval forces there in North America. And in the meantime, there are also things going on outside of North America, but I'm focusing upon North America because it is most influential upon what happens with the colonies, with the colonists. Like I've already noted, there were many colonists on the British side in this war. There were many colonial units that were raised by the colonies. There were units from New England and from Virginia and from the South. And like I said already, Washington led one of these units in this battle of Monongahela, which is also called Braddock's defeat. So the year after war is officially declared, the next major fight is Fort William Henry. It had already been attacked by the French previously, and the British had repulsed them. But this time, in 1757, on the southern end of Lake George, which is on the Hudson River in modern-day eastern New York, Fort William Henry, a major British fort that protected the Hudson River and let them use it as a way for their ships, was defeated by the French and the Indians. And the British surrendered. The French, under the command of General Marquis de Montcalm, who is going to be, for the rest of the war, the main French leader, he gives the British good terms of surrender. He says that you can go back to, you go back. You don't have to be. We're not going to take you prisoner. You can go back to your homes as long as you don't fight. However, the Indians, who are under the command of Montcalm, who are allied with him, they ignore these terms of surrender. They are angry because they hate the British, and what they do is they slaughter the garrison that's in Fort William Henry, the garrison that has already surrendered to the French. A major atrocity. It's devastating. And the next year, the next major action that takes place is in March of 1758. Secretary of State William Pitt, I believe he is a new one in Great Britain. So he's come to power as the Secretary of State, the one who oversees the efforts of the government in the war. He replaces the North American British commander, who was previously the leader of all of the British forces in North America, with this man named General Abercrombie. And he begins policies for working with colonial legislators so they can gain colonial support for the war. So these policies include paying for the supplies of the colonies. He wants to reimburse them. He wants to provide all of the supplies that the colonies need in order to fight in the war for Great Britain. And he also promises that he will recommend to Parliament that Parliament reimburse the colonies for their efforts in fighting the war. And he also allows colonial officers above a certain rank to have the same status, the same type of rank as British regular officers. So they have the same prestige, the same pay rate, that sort of thing. So he really wins the colonies to the side of the British war effort, because beforehand the colonists had been looked down upon, and they are still going to be looked down upon by the British, but they were poorly treated. The colonies were fighting at their own expense. They were not being reimbursed by the British, but this man, William Pitt, the Secretary of State, he promises that they will be reimbursed and they will be supported by the British Parliament. So this works to really motivate the colonies, the colonial legislatures, to raise up more troops. The thousands of troops, I think at least around 7,000 colonial troops are raised to participate in this war. And it may have been more than that, but at the very least. thousands of troops are raised to wage war on the French in North America. In July of 1758, the next major battle that happens is Fort Louisbourg. The British had already attempted to take this fort. Fort Louisbourg is on one of the waterways that the French use near in the Great Lakes region, near, I believe, the St. Lawrence River. And they attack it under the command of General Geoffrey Amherst, who is the leader of the British forces now, and also his subordinate, James Wolfe, who is basically the direct commander. He was the field commander, basically. And they gain Fort Louisbourg. This frees up the St. Lawrence River so that the British can now have a freeway to the major city of Quebec and Montreal, so they can now gain superiority over the French in the waterways of New France. This is a 6-week siege that happens in order to take this fort, but eventually they gain it. In August of that year, this is one of the most notable fights of the British. It is led by Colonel John Bradstreet on Lake Ontario. There was a fort called Fort Frontenac, and he does a daring thing. He has 3,000 colonial troops, who take boats, they're flat-bottom barges called bateaux. He takes them up the river and up the coast of this lake to Fort Frontenac, over 60 miles, and he compels the French to surrender with little effort by putting his cannons on a mountain nearby, and the French surrender, and then he destroys the fort. Now this opens up and really prevents the French from sending supplies to the Ohio River Valley, because this was a major fort that allowed them to do that. This is a major blow to the French, and John Bradstreet really shows great courage, ingenuity, and leadership in this. It was very daring to take these boats up that way in the surprise attack. And so that's a major victory for the French. In November of 1758, they finally, like Braddock did in the beginning of the war, they attempt to attack Fort Duquesne. The British force, when they get near the fort, the French are lacking in supplies. By this time of the war in 1758, the French are not providing enough supplies or resources for the French forces in North America. They are focusing their efforts upon other areas, Europe and elsewhere, as well as I believe the Caribbean. There was fighting in the Caribbean as well. But the French actually abandon Fort Duquesne when the British approach. And so the British, not only do they abandon it, but they actually destroy the fort. The British take the forks of the Ohio River, and Washington is actually involved in this as well. This is the last part in the war. He's leading small units as a colonel in the Virginia militia, and he doesn't. Because of his efforts in it, he thinks that he's going to be promoted, but he's not promoted. So he actually resigns from the Virginia militia, and he goes back to Virginia, and he enters the Virginia House of Burgesses to become a politician there in Virginia. But this, again, now the British have control of the Ohio River region, basically, with this victory. They established a fort in its place called Fort Pitt, and now they are poised to enter into New France proper and the major cities of Quebec and Montreal. And so that's what happens. But before this, there is another victory they have to secure. In 1759, the next year, in July, Fort Niagara, which is placed where Lake Niagara, I'm sorry, Niagara, the Niagara River enters Lake Ontario. The British Iroquois take the French Fort Niagara after a siege. This results in Indian submission in New France to British rule because they realize that their French allies are not going to win, that they are now losing, and there is really no hope in sight. So the Indians in New France, they are just not supporting the French, and they are not fighting against the British. In September of that summer, 1759, finally the British approach Quebec, the major city of Quebec. This is the last stand of the French, really. And there, the French are under the command, again, of General Montcalm. James Wolfe is there as well. And they are besieging Quebec. And they are the British actually destroy many buildings, homes around the city. And they are, they have their guns poised upon it, aimed at it. So what the French do is actually go out of the city to confront the British on an open area called the Plains of Abraham. So you have a pitched battle here where the French make tactical errors and they are soundly defeated by the British. However, the British lose their commander, James Wolfe, who was one of their best commanders at that time, and also Montcalm as well is killed. He is mortally wounded in the fighting. So that is the beginning of the end, really, for the French. When Quebec is taken, the French naval forces are basically powerless now at this time, and the British now have a clear path to the rest of New France, most specifically the last major city, which is Montreal. So in 1760, the next year, the British capture Montreal. They defeat the French. They gain Canada for the most part. Basically, the French do not have any major outposts in New France to make any efforts to counterattack the British. And actually, the way that they were able to make such progress here is because the Indians that were allied with the British, the Iroquois, they had convinced the Canadian Mohawks living in modern-day Canada to avoid supporting the French. So you have the Indians negotiating on behalf of the British with the Indians that had once been aligned with the French. So the British have very little opposition from the Indians. So they capture the city of Montreal there, and that is the end of France's efforts in North America against the British. The war would continue for another 3 years all around the world. So it wasn't until 1763 that they drew up a treaty in Paris. The French admit defeat. The results of the Treaty of Paris were that Great Britain gets Canada, New France. They also get the Ohio River Valley region. Spain is involved in this as well. In fact, let me look up here on the results of this. The French, I wasn't sure if the French lost Louisiana or they gained it. If I'm not mistaken, the British gain, or I think the French actually get to keep the Louisiana territory at this time. Excuse me, I should I should have known this, but I was focusing upon more the eastern colonies. You can look it up if you need to. Real-time research right now. Yeah, France ceded Louisiana to Spain. So the British now have control of all of northeastern North America, while the French have lost control of Louisiana. So the French are really humiliated, obviously. The British now have more land. And so the results of this are very, very powerful upon the colonists. However, one thing that really aggravated the colonists was the British, in response to the Indians, because they don't want to have the Indians opposing them in their activities in North America. The king or parliament, the government, they issued what's called the Proclamation of 1763, which is a response to something called Pontiac's Rebellion. The Proclamation of 1763, let me talk about that first, is the king announces that the British colonists, the American colonists, they are not allowed to settle west of the Allegheny Mountains. The Allegheny Mountains stretch from between or around eastern West Virginia to central Pennsylvania. They're not allowed to settle or to have settlements west of that line. They can trade over there, and there can be British forts there, but there are not to be any settlements. Now, this is in response to when the war ends in 1763, the French give up. In the Great Lakes region, Pontiac's Rebellion begins. It's called Pontiac's Rebellion because he is one of the major Indian leaders who leads an attack on specifically Fort Detroit, where modern day Detroit is. But it is a effort of many Indian tribes to attack the British settlements and forts in the Great Lakes region for about a year. It doesn't end until 1764. They are trying to push the British out of the Great Lakes in the Ohio Valley region, but the British put down the rebellion, and the British also respond by trying to get the colonists to stop going west. This does not deter the colonists, however, from going west, because they want the land. They want the resources. They want the trading posts. So they still, if you have settlements there, most of them do not simply pick up and leave from west of the Alleghenies simply because their government told them to do so. That would be nonsense because they're leaving their livelihood. They're leaving the lives that they built. So the colonists are really very angry, many of them, at this demand of the British government to get out of the region. Many other things happen from the war that contribute to the discontent and the aggravation of the English colonists in many of the 13 colonies. So British and colonial harmony was severely ruptured, obviously, especially due to several taxes that were imposed on them. On the other hand, Great Britain was motivated even more to keep the colonies under its control because it now had new lands to exploit, and it had done so at great cost to itself. However, the colonists now had a greater sense of independence because during the war, they had had colonial militias raised up. They had actually died in this war. They had given up their time and their resources, their energy, and their money towards this war. And also, they had proven that they could fight for themselves, and they could defend themselves as well. Another thing that led to this disharmony between the British and the British colonists was the British actually were still occupying their lands. They had many soldiers there because they wanted to keep them the colonists under control, so they could use them to gain the resources from the New World, and also to get money from them. And that's what I'm going to talk about now, is 3 acts that, if you are a Revolutionary War, I guess, student, you'll know that there are 3 different tax acts: the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767. The Sugar Act, obviously, was a tax on sugar. The stamp, it had to do with commerce, with trade. However, the Stamp Act was a tax on any printed material. Any paper had to get a stamp on it that cost money to the colonists in 1765. And then you have the Townshend Acts, which is a series of other taxes upon the colonists. So the colonists now have British occupation. There are British soldiers that actually have the right to quarter within colonial homes there. And the British do not want the colonists to have their own standing army, and they want them to provide all this money. Now, the main reason for all these new taxes was because the British went into debt because of fighting this war. They're trying to compensate for the war, pay off the cost of the war, and they're doing it at the expense of the colonists. Now, like I said at the beginning, another key result of this war was that many of the key men that will be involved in the revolution were now experienced in warfare, leadership, and diplomacy, like we saw Washington, Daniel Morgan, Thomas Gage, Benjamin Franklin, Horatio Gates, and probably at least a few others. This war set the stage for the American Revolution, because now the colonists have, like I said, greater sense of independence. They are now at odds with the British. They are not liking British rule of themselves. They have fought a war for Great Britain, and they feel like they're being punished for it because of all these new taxes that they have to pay the British government. Not only that, remember, it is the famous taxation without representation. They did not have representatives in Parliament to have a say in the Parliament, and yet the British are levying these new taxes upon them in the 1760s. And also, they have now a precedent of getting together in the Albany Congress to unite together as a united government to defend themselves and to raise funds for all their resources, all their logistics, and so on. So this sets the stage for the American Revolution, as we've noted. The King's hand was obviously in this war, as he is in every event of history. He was forming people to be ready for the American Revolution, and the colonists as well. Now, on the note, because of the Christian podcast, I must note that at this time, it is right after the First Great Awakening, and there is a great resurgence of liberalism, really, that we have discussed earlier in this podcast with me and Casey. Enlightenment ideas are infiltrating places of higher education. It seems to be that there is a backsliding among people, even though they have just experienced this great awakening. Obviously, there are still many Christians here, but most of the leaders of the revolution are not devout evangelical Christians. Yet at the same time, we must remember God is always having his people working even behind the scenes. The gospel is still going forth. And also, this new nation that will be formed will allow for the free practice and the expansion of Christianity and the preaching of the gospel. So that is the French and Indian War in synopsis form. Thank you for listening to this edition of the King's Hand in History podcast. Next time, we will continue telling the story of America, Lord willing. I plan on talking about it's slipping my mind, the Olive Branch Petition in 1775, which was issued to the British government, telling them that they did not wish to be independent from Britain, and yet at the same time they had to fight for their rights against the British. So we'll continue the story of the King's Hand in the forming of the United States in this 250th anniversary of the beginning of the American Revolution. Until next time, I hope that you will check out the podcast. Please, if you appreciate this, it helps if you subscribe, if you share this content on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you are so inclined, leave us a review. We also have a Facebook group called the King's Hand in History Students. If you want to interact with me and listeners of the show, please join there and give me any feedback through email or however you want to reach me. If you want to reach me on Facebook, that's fine too. My email is chris.g.vanduzen@gmail.com. Until next time, keep looking for the King's Hand in your life and in everything, and proclaim his glorious deeds. God bless.